So how did the School of Shamanic Midwifery begin? How did it start? Well, I started my midwifery practice as a 26-year-old. I did my hospital midwifery training and hightailed it out of there as fast as I could to join the tribe who were providing home birth services, because I could not handle or stand or be part of what I witnessed was going on in hospitals, which could be seen as nothing less than institutionalized acts of abuse on women masquerading as safety. So I started my home birth practice back in 1984 as an apprentice to Maggie Leckie Thompson, who was one of the few home birth midwives providing that service in Sydney, and she was one of the leaders, and it was a great honour to be able to do an apprenticeship with her. So I worked with her as her assistant for nearly 12 months, going to births with her, doing antenatal and postnatal visits with her and for her. And that process was so enlightening and basically involved a lot of unlearning what I'd been taught in midwifery school in the hospital, which was all about graphs and numbers and seeing the process of pregnancy and birth as more of a mechanical thing than the organic thing that it actually is. And in working with Maggie in my unlearning process, what I did was I learned from Maggie, from reading lots of alternate midwifery textbooks, in particular Elizabeth Davis's book, Heart and Hands, and then Janine Pavati Baker's prenatal yoga book. And mostly I learned from the women that I served with Maggie about all the ranges of normal. In other words, what's possible, what is possible around birthing, what different women's bodies do in response to the opening that's required for bringing a baby earthside. So I learned a lot from the women and unlearned the stuff I'd learned in midwifery school. I didn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, but because I wanted to be able to remain bilingual, so to speak, to be able to speak the language that was being used in caring for women in the system, and then also caring for or providing a service for the women who were choosing to birth outside the system. And I learned a lot through the years there, and I started presenting papers at conferences and about marketing midwifery, and I got involved in the College of Midwives in New South Wales, the New South Wales Midwives Association, and became the member on the executive and took the first ever role of publicity officer. So my responsibility was to get midwives in the news and respond to anything that was needing responding to from a midwifery perspective. And I started giving workshops on the women's mysteries and the spiritual practice of menstruation in 1992 with Sani Hamilton, who was the wife of Black Bear, our shamanic teacher. And Jackson was a baby at the time, a baby in arms, and he came along to the workshops, and it was wonderful doing that with Sani. And my focus on my work went in two directions at that point, not just birth but also menstruation and rites of passage, and I learned so much through that process, particularly how one rite of passage leads to the next. So I'd been giving workshops on the spiritual practice of menstruation and rites of passage which I called Moonsong, and preparation for birth, pregnancy workshops. I was giving them regularly from about the early 2000s, maybe earlier. Yeah, late 90s. And I'd always had this idea, as some of my friends who had older children than me, their daughters were finishing school, and I thought about how ill-prepared they were for the world, especially in terms of understanding their bodies and the cycles and what lay ahead as they grew up more. And I had this idea that I would love to have a finishing school for girls, not in the Switzerland variety of preparing them for all the odd things that those seem to do, like how to set tables and serve appropriately. This is more about women's bodies owner manual 101. That actually never really happened, although I did do some one-on-one stuff with these young women. But then in 2009 I presented at the Australian Home Birth Conference in Paddington, Sydney. I co-presented with my dear sisters and colleagues Cheryl Sidery and Shay Caplice. We presented a paper on, I can't remember what it was called, but like 60 years of practice between us and what have we learned. And I guess for the first time I really spoke out about my spiritual beliefs and how they came together with my midwifery practice and the story of that and how I practiced that. And many women, midwives, contacted me after that because what I'd said had resonated with them, which was basically about the underlying spirituality of birth. And I say underlying because in that day, in that world, there in Sydney, very few people were seeing the connection between birth and spirituality, or fundamentally the sacred aspects of birth. I mean, everybody who felt that way was feeling it in their own way, but I started talking about it out loud. And following that, I had an email from a young, newly graduated midwifery student who was in one of the beginning Bachelor of Midwifery programs. And she said to me, her name was Melody Bourne, and she said to me in an email that she was really keen to learn from what I'd said and more about it. And she said to me, you've had so many great teachers, and one in particular that she was interested in was Janine Pavati Baker, who at that stage had been dead for 4 years and was obviously no longer available on this earthly realm for her to give her teachings. And I was presenting Janine's work via myself, and Melody said, you've had all these great teachers, you've learned all this wonderful stuff, you've got so much experience. It's really your responsibility to teach this to the rest of us who are interested. And I really felt that as a call to action. It wasn't what I expected I would do with my life, but there back in 2008, I started planning what ended up being the School of Shamanic Midwifery, and it started its first year-long program in 2009. And we call those women who did that program the Virgin Mermaids, because they invested a lot in me, trusting me that I would deliver what I'd said I would deliver, which was a earth-based spiritual experience around the cycle of the 4 seasons, bringing in the principles and practices of shamanic midwifery, which were about learning the women's mysteries and the way of the midwife and the way of the shamanic midwife, which is she who brings together the physical and the spiritual to facilitate transformation in people, not just around birth, but around the whole of life, with all the rites of passage. So birth, menarche, childbirth, menopause, and death. And so now, as I record this in April of 2014, we're sort of midway, or 1/3 of the way through the 5th ever program of the 4 Seasons Journey, which is the main program provided by the School of Shamanic Midwifery. And I'm teaching that with co-teacher who has been through all the 4 Seasons Journey in an apprenticeship program to be able to come to this point of being able to teach these with me. Her name Tallulah Goff. And the school is growing. The next year, the 6th year of the program, is taking bookings, and there's prospects of me travelling to provide a year-long program over in Europe, potentially next year in 2015, the Northern 4 Seasons Journey. And we'll see if that wants to happen. There's an apprenticeship program within the 4 Seasons Journey as we're growing our future facilitators, and there's apprenticeship programs for the Moon Song Workshop and the Pregnancy Workshop as we work together, the mermaids, as we call ourselves, the students and graduates of the School of Shamanic Midwifery, the GLAD of mermaids, the group of mermaids, working together to spread the word, to raise consciousness, or to raise consciousness, as we're now saying, to help do what we can to heal the wounded feminine and the wounded masculine of our patriarchal culture by basically helping women and their men to remember, like put themselves back together with the information that is within the teachings of the program. And it's not like this is new to them. It's actually very ancient wisdom. It's wisdom that's held within our bodies, that it's wisdom that the earth teaches us if we care to look. And it's really a remembering and a remembering, as Janine would say, of putting ourselves back together with this information. So the School of Shamanic Midwifery is a process in and of itself too, and it's growing, and the guardians of the school are constantly looking at what we need to do to best serve those who wish to learn, and to do all sorts of different projects as well. The most recent projects, which were born out of the Seven Sisters Festival just now at the end of March in 2014, are on eating disorders, what's going on and what can we do about it. A circle of women will have formed from that and take that further forward. And then the Heart Womb Collective, which is about the whole story of the womb, you know, including healing abortion and miscarriage and working with infertility as well as birth. And we have the Red Tent Dreaming group, who are promoting red tents and red talks as opposed to TED Talks, which are women talking to women about relevant things. We've got a documentary planned. We've got on the herstory as opposed to the history, and so many more things that are seeds gestating in the womb of the GLAD of mermaids. So that's how the school started, and we'll see where she goes. held by a group of women supported by their families and their men, to do what we can to help the healing. Blessed be.